All right, well, today then we conclude our 2018 Back to Basics series, our theme, Rising Above, Spiritual Basics for Toxic, Troubling Times. We've been embracing the profound relevancy of these principles to the things going on in this day. And we've addressed subjects over the 5 sessions previously of rising above divisiveness and strife, rising above the BS, the toxic belief systems and all the nonsense afoot, rising above hopelessness. And I want to thank Reverend Josh and Dr. Michelle for their fine installments, number 4 and 5, rising above scarcity and rising above unworthiness. And so today we conclude with rising above, and it's maybe the clincher, cynicism and hate. You know, there's been a phenomenon or a syndrome identified, and I think it's kind of an interesting thing. It is called outrage addiction. And it's a very unmistakable and very prevalent kind of an energy of anger and aggressiveness, cynicism, and pessimism. I think I even saw hints of this in a list of some interesting posters that was given to me. Listen to some of the inscriptions on these posters. One says, the human body has 7 trillion nerves, and some people manage to get on every single one of them. Not us, of course. Somebody. Another poster said, I'm sorry I hurt you when I called you stupid. I really thought you already knew. And this next one, this is really true here. A poster said, some people seriously need a speed bump between their brain and their mouth. Yeah. I think one of my favorites is, it's just a matter of time before they add the word syndrome after my last name. And then finally, there's a poster that says, sometimes I question my sanity. Sometimes it replies. It's interesting, and I think also sad, how typical it is for people to default into lashing out against themselves and others, and tearing down rather than building up. And the extreme of that is when that tearing down becomes hate. Outright hate of those who are different, those who disagree, those who are perceived as threats. And I tell you, the principles of science of mind and spirit offer us so much healing help when dealing with all of this. So I want to return to just some basic principles to conclude this series that give us the understanding of how to rise above all this stuff. And the first one is that in the science of mind and spirit, living it is not about hiding from our challenges, but instead transcending our challenges by transforming our consciousness. Okay? Now that has to begin by looking willingly, compassionately, and honestly at what needs to evolve and change in our awareness. Looking at that which is life-limiting in our awareness and in our life. Looking at what is counterproductive, maybe even destructive, dysfunctional, and by all means, looking at what might be heartless in our own lives and being willing to work with that. So we need to look at that. And I know that some students of this teaching for years and years would say, no, I don't like to look at that. That's looking at the negative. But we can't work constructively if we don't know what needs to be healed. As the great teacher and metaphysician Louise Hay once wrote, if you want to clean the house, you have to look at the dirt. All right, you don't get stuck in it, but we have to look at that. And we also have to look at that collectively as well. It's important collectively to acknowledge what's going on, but we just don't have to sink in it. We acknowledge it. And even several decades ago, the great Joseph Campbell prophetically saw some of what's going on today, and he called it out. He called it the wasteland. And he said the wasteland is any world in which force and not love, indoctrination and not education, authority and not experience prevail in the ordering of lives. That's so powerful. To what degree is force and indoctrination and heavy-handedness, authority, the rule when what we really know is powerful is love and education and the grist from the mill of our experience. So we have to take a look at that. And when we find ourselves in this kind of a wasteland, as Campbell called it, one option is just to lapse into cynicism. Or another thing is to wish for the good old days. And maybe you hear that, is to think that it was better then, although it usually isn't or wasn't. But what we wish for and long for it to be different and to be in the better days. But actually, we have to be present to what's going on. We have to be present to the working out of a lot of pent-up pain sometimes, individually or most particularly culturally. We have to be present to decaying systems and the wake that process of the obsolete falling away that it creates. We have to be present to it. And then I believe that we have to water that wasteland with higher understanding, with inspired vision, and with creative innovation. And when we do that kind of thing, then that wasteland can become a paradise. And it begins by honestly looking at, but not getting trapped in, that material. And the next basic principle of the science, mind, and spirit is that ours is an affirmative teaching, and thus to live it is to live affirmatively. We believe in affirmative living. But I want to be quick to say that affirmative living is not Pollyanna-like positive thinking. It is not that. That may be important and good for your life, but that's not what affirmative living is. Affirmative living is a deep and abiding dedication to honoring our spiritual birthright as creative centers in mind. Understanding then, as creative centers, that we look at the lesser. We look at what isn't working, but we don't get taken up by it. We don't get pulled down by it. But instead we remember that we're equipped to initiate a new chain of causation through higher ideas for a clearer and more provocative and compelling vision. We look at that and we own that. So we may look at the lesser, but then we stand for the greater. And that's what affirmative living is about. Is that, yes, you honestly acknowledge what needs to change individually in your life or in the world. And yet what you're really compelled by and committed to is championing an emerging vision for your life. Are you championing that in this new year? And an emerging vision for what the world is seeking to become and what humanity is seeking to become. To own that. To be about that. To not get caught up in the cynicism and the rancor and the hate, because that's not going to take you or us anywhere. I love it that Dr. Holmes, just shortly before he passed over into the greater dimensions of life, at our Asilomar conference, a beautiful site right on the ocean in Pacific Grove near Monterey and Carmel, he would always conclude that conference when he was alive with what he called his Sermon by the Sea, given in a beautiful chapel that had big glass windows looking out onto the ocean. They called it the Sermon by the Sea. And in 1959, he said something so powerful. Hear this. It would be wonderful if a group of persons should arrive on the earth who were for something and against nothing. This would be the summum bonum of human organization, wouldn't it? Find me one person who is for something and against nothing, who is redeemed enough not to condemn others out of the burden of his own soul. And I will find another Savior, another Jesus, and an enlightened human being. So we're for something. Yes, we look at what needs to change, and that catalyzes this higher vision that we stand for. That's affirmative living. So we have a discipline in this teaching, and that we help people understand and work with very creatively in our classes. And that is, it's the willingness to explore what needs to evolve in our thinking and in our awareness. And we do this not as a guilt trip. That has no place in this teaching. We look at what needs to evolve because we know that the inner becomes the outer. And so with willingness and compassion, we look at that stuff. Now, I've been in this teaching for over 50 years. And week in, week out, I'm looking at what needs to change. As I honestly look at my own behaviors, as my own slips of tongue, at the shadow material in my own life, I'm constantly being given hints about how I can evolve my inner life. And I relish that. Sometimes it's a bit of a ouchy kind of a wake-up call, but at the same time, it's like, okay, this is exciting. I'm going to be about that enrichment. I'm going to learn and grow and evolve, and that's what we are about. Now, if you look at the key idea, the inner idea that seems to source the outrage that is so prevalent, and that devolves into hate, I want to suggest that it is very much centered around an inflated, unbridled sense of self-importance. An inflated sense of self-righteousness or self-importance tends to spawn a kind of outrage if we don't deal with it. I love what Carlos Castaneda said in one sentence. He nails it. Our self-importance requires that we spend most of our lives offended by someone. Don't we need to hear that again? Our self-importance, and he's talking about an inflated sense of self-importance, not genuine self-love, but a sense of self-importance and superiority. Our self-importance requires that we spend most of our lives offended by someone. You're calling that in when you get locked into that. And thus, the outrage. And I think getting even clearer about this, drilling into it, is there's a guy, David Brin, who's a scientist and a science fiction writer. Oh, it's so powerful. He says, self-righteousness can be heady, seductive, and even addictive. Any truly honest person will admit that this state feels good. You know what I'm saying? Don't sit there looking pious at me. He goes on to say, the pleasure of knowing with subjective certainty that you are right and your opponents are deeply and despicably wrong. Oh, it can feel so intense and delicious that many people actively return to it again and again. Indeed, one could look at our present-day political landscape and argue that a relentless addiction to indignation may be one of the chief drivers of obstinate dogmatism and an inability to negotiate pragmatic solutions to myriad modern problems. It may be the ultimate propellant behind the current culture war. So as we look at all of this, instead of sliding into cynicism or getting enrolled in despising and demonizing people, what do we get to do? What's of a higher order for us to do? Well, the science of mind says, remember our oneness. Remember the universal mind. As Emerson said, we lie in the lap of an immense intelligence. And it wants to use us and inspire us. So our calling is the challenge to address issues positively and to explore what's possible. What's possible here? And as we work with others, especially others who disagree with us, it's to look at what's our dreams, our shared dreams, and how can we find a common ground there? And it's to listen a little more, to really listen. There's not a lot of listening going on. To listen more, and to create dialogue across belief systems. And actually, to remember also that it's usually systems, not people, that are inadequate or immoral. So to sort of focus in on this, rising above cynicism and hate in a high consciousness way, I would suggest you is to care for the sacred again. To care for the sacred. And as I am wont to do, remember the word care and its 4 letters, and you remember the elements of what I'm about to offer us. The first thing in caring for the sacred is sacred community. Sacred community. In a wonderful book that has been given to me by the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist in the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, he titled it so creatively. The title is, "Thank You for Being Late." And I think some of you can receive that gratitude, right? Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you for being late. And I'll tell you why he chose that title in a little bit here. But the book is really about the unrest, the stress, the unhealthy stress caused by acceleration in so many areas in our culture right now. And he calls out the three that are really at the center of this unrest and this unhealthy stress we're all, in one way or another, to one degree or another, experiencing. The first is rampant technological expansion, initiated in 2007 by the release of the iPhone. And then Moore's law shifting in, by which technology now is doubling in complexity every 2 years. So it's almost geometric in its progress. So technology increasing is one. The second one is environmental change and erosion. And the third is pervasive globalization. And Friedman says, it's no surprise that people feel fearful or unmoored these days. We are living through one of the greatest inflection points in history. The three largest forces on the planet, technology, globalization, and climate change, are all accelerating at once. As a result, so many aspects of our societies, workplaces, and geopolitics are being reshaped and need to be reimagined. When there is a change in the pace of change in so many realms at once, it's easy to become overwhelmed by it all. Have you a sense of that? Do you experience that? And so he offers in his book some antidotes, but his top two ones are the ones I wanted to seize upon. And the first antidote for the stress and the degradation that can be a part of participating in all this change is healthy community. Healthy community, he says. That's why I believe community is sacred. You know, technology and the ability to communicate with everything and everyone at an instant doesn't supplant community, which is also why I am so positive about the future of our community here at Mile High Church and spiritual community everywhere, because it may need to change in its format, and yet it is important because we come together in healthy community and we have that sense of belonging. Our hearts open. We remember that love is what it's all about when we're dealing with cynicism and hate. That love's, as Jennifer and Tom saying, it's going to win out ultimately. And we come together to remember that, to open our hearts together, to see the sacred in one another so that we can take that consciousness out into the world. And he also suggests that healthy community is ultimately a community that is very diverse and welcomes diversity. And we've always been about that. We welcome all peoples and all their uniquenesses. In fact, as we work on our unfolding white-hot vision for the future, radical inclusivity is a part of it. Because we know we've been that and we want to even more consciously be that. Radically inclusive of all beings. No one rejected from the experience of spirit. No one. And he also suggests that in coming together in healthy community, we get to practice being the people that we are really designed and destined to be. And we do that by lifting up these spiritual principles and not just hearing them in our heads, but taking them to our hearts and moving them out into the world in the way that we are being, every one of us. And he also suggests that healthy communities need to resuscitate and re-enchant the golden rule and repopularize that. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or making sure that that which goes forth from you in any way is that which you would gladly have returned to you. That is healthy community. And I would suggest that sacred community like that truly is so important. In World War I, there was a unit of the American troops that was bivouacked for a time in a small village in Italy. And during that time, the chaplain of this American unit got to know the Roman Catholic priest of the small village parish. Okay? And they actually quickly became deep friends as they shared their hearts and what they were facing and the roles they played. And that deep friendship was very important to both of them. Well, the unit got its marching orders to leave, and it did. And shortly afterward, word came back that the chaplain was killed. And this deeply aggrieved that priest, so much so that, knowing that this chaplain had no family, really, to speak of, he asked the military authorities if they would allow him to bury the man in the cemetery behind his church. And the military finally agreed to that, but then he got pushed back from the Catholic Church authorities, saying that they could not approve of having a non-Catholic buried in the Catholic cemetery. So, sadly, the priest buried his beloved friend right outside the fence of the cemetery behind the church. Well, a number of years later, one of the veterans from that very unit traveled back to Italy and to that little village and looked up the priest, who was now rather old. And he knew what had happened, so he immediately asked to see the grave of that chaplain. So he went there and he showed him the grave, but it was inside the fence. And he said, "I see, Father, that you got permission to move the body." And the priest said, "No, I didn't. They told me where I couldn't bury the body, but no one told me I couldn't move the fence." Time to move some fences? Yeah. Sacred community. That includes all. And I think the second one is sacred attention. We believe in this teaching that where we place our attention is a sacred choice, fundamental to being a conscious spiritual being. We understand that where our attention goes, energy flows. Where attention goes, energy flows. And so we're called to be very conscious about where our attention is going. And if we find ourselves upset with what's going on or lapsing into some cynicism, or even, sadly, devolving into some hatred, then what we are called to do is to shift our focus of attention from all of that to the reality that we want to create. Now, we don't shame ourselves for having lapsed into that stuff, but we give ourselves a wake-up call and take our sacred choice of attention to the reality we want to create, to the greater life, to the greater relationship, whatever it is that we want to be about. And so we focus our attentiveness upon that. All right? So this is a commitment to really watching in these changing times what's going on in my awareness, and to take charge of our pace. Find times when we can indeed slow down. Take charge of our appetites. Is consumerism really going to make us happy? And take charge of this awareness, cultivating a regular and a vibrant spiritual practice, because spiritual practice in our lives is no longer just an optional nicety. In these days, it's actually an essential for an empowered life. And then that brings us to the title of Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late. And he chose that title because he would often be entertaining at breakfasts friends and diplomats and various officials, but inevitably, in the congestion and the complexity of Washington, D.C. traffic, they'd be late. And there was, for a time, a bit of upset and anger about that. But then he realized that it was okay that they were late. In fact, it was a gift. And he said, "I noticed it felt good to have those few moments of unplanned for, unscheduled time. I was beginning to feel overwhelmed and exhausted by the dizzying pace of change. I needed to give myself and my guests permission to slow down. I needed permission to be alone with my thoughts without having to tweet about them, take a picture of them, or share them with anyone. I began to sincerely declare, thank you for being late." Now we can create that same opportunity to stay centered, to call in a deeper peace, sacred attention, your great gift, your great honor to cultivate. Sacred community, attention, and now sacred reconciliation. This is assessing, who have I placed outside the fence of my heart? What old wound have I been fostering for far too long that gets projected onto whomever and whomever whenever they upset me? And is it time for healing? To move out of that victim space into a powerful space of heart and love. And to do that collectively as well. To be willing to look at reconciliation in our culture would be to be willing to reconcile the disenfranchised, to reconcile with the different faiths, to reconcile with the Native Americans and the African Americans, and the list goes on and on. But we move to a higher plane with that reconciliation. Sometimes, though, we think it's not possible, but it really is. I recall reading an article about what happened in the Deep South about 15 years ago when a man named Eugene Burden, who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, opened a store that was a shop and a museum for the Ku Klux Klan. And the day it opened, 5,000 people were protesting it. In fact, a guy backed his pickup truck into the front of the building and did tons and tons of damage to it. Well, one woman who was there protesting was appalled by that and said, "We can protest, but the violence is not okay." So she volunteered to help with the cleanup. And in the process of several days of helping to clean up, she found herself falling in love with Eugene Burden. And shortly thereafter, they were married. Now, she didn't believe in him or support his philosophy, but in bringing him that love, his philosophy shifted. Now, when that happened, the Klan threw him out. He lost his job, and they fell into poverty. And so they found themselves living in a truck, his truck, 2 little kids, her kids, and them living in a truck. So Burden, now who had left his old philosophy, had to humble himself, and he approached the Reverend Joseph Kennedy, a black minister in that town, and he said to him, "I know you don't trust me, but I need help. You know, my family's in that truck, and we're hungry." And Kennedy just looked right at him, and he said, "You know what? We can talk theology later." And he took that family to a steakhouse and bought them a meal. Then he paid for a week's lodging in a motel. An incredible act of heart when he could have rejected the man, even though he had begun a transformation. Well, in the coming months, that man became a member of that church, of that all-black church. And then he became a sustaining and a wonderful member of that community. Who knows what can happen when a higher intention, born of the heart, guides us. Sacred community, attention, reconciliation. And I would close this by commending to us sacred earth. You know, as we deal with so much of the change going on and the low vibration, cynicism, and even hatred, it's important to stay grounded. I mean literally grounded. I'm called to spend more time with the earth. I don't do enough of that. What I know is that when we get out in nature, maybe walking barefoot in a couple of months on the earth, and we align ourselves with the deep vibration of Mother Earth. We can allow its healing energy, its balancing energy to remind us of the bigger circle of life that we're only one little speck of. And then some of our inflated self-importance dissolves into a natural love of all of life. And we walk with a new kind of balance. I invite you in these times of great change is be with the Mother Earth, and let it resource you and bless you. Yeah, I think that could help us. Rising above cynicism and hate, sacred community, sacred attention, sacred reconciliation, and sacred earth. Our spiritual basics, I tell you what, they absolutely are healing and empowered in toxic and troubling times. But I tell you what, the drum I've been beating through this series is we're called not just to have a wonderful belief system, but we are called to a deeper spiritual maturity That is about practicing inwardly, deepening our lives, and then living that out in our experience. It's time to walk our talk, for we are the ones we've been waiting for.